Not every place human beings touch leaves a trace in history. But there is one place where simply turning back toward it quietly reshapes an entire inner life. If I asked you today, why have billions of people for more than 1,000 years circled together around a simple block of stone in the middle of the desert? You would probably answer with familiar things. It is ritual, it is tradition, it is religion. But if it were only that, the phenomenon could not have endured so faithfully. And it certainly could not make strangers of different skin, different languages, seeing it for the first time, break into tears as if they had just found something they lost long ago. Some secrets are not found in what was built, but in why people are pulled back there. The Kaaba is such a place. It is not tall, not massive, not showy. It was not raised to make people look up in awe. On the contrary, it stands there quietly, almost challenging every standard of what we call great. And yet somehow the whole world turns around it. Not by geography, but by the heart. Not by power, but by submission. And that is what makes it unsettling, worth pondering, and impossible to ignore. There is a question rarely asked. What would happen if human life truly needed a center? Not a political center, not an economic center, but a spiritual center where every choice, every longing, every fear must finally return to be defined. In the universe, no movement exists without a focal point. Planets do not drift without direction. Celestial bodies do not move in chaos. Everything runs around an axis. But what about the human being? The Kaaba enters humanity's story not as something invented, but as something designated, a place not meant to be admired, but to orient. When people turn toward it, they do something strangely radical. They accept that their life is not the ultimate center, that there is a point higher, firmer, more unchanging, and that very admission frees them from inner chaos. What is striking is this. The Kaaba does not invite with words. It does not persuade with arguments. It simply stands there. And that silence is its strongest call. No one is forced to come. But once they have turned toward it, very few can turn away without carrying the feeling that they have touched something beyond time. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. From this moment, set aside everything you think you know about the Kaaba. Because the story we are about to enter is not a history lesson and not a familiar religious sermon. This is a journey back into the center, where the deepest human questions begin to surface. What am I turning my life around? And if I slip off that axis, what happens? The Kaaba is not only a destination for feet, it is an anchor of an invisible order. When millions move around it together, what is happening is not only the synchronization of bodies, but the resonance of meaning. There, people are not required to understand everything. They are only invited to return. And in that simple act, a silent declaration is established. That the world is not meaningless, that life is not drifting, that there is a sacred axis. And if it is lost, the human being will lose himself. Perhaps that is why the Kaaba can unsettle people even before they ever arrive, because it asks a question no one can avoid. If I am not turning around the sacred, then what is quietly controlling the orbit of my life? Power, ego, fear, or invisible idols I have never dared to name? If something in that question touches you, then stay, because this journey does not end with what the Kaaba is, but with why it still stands there, and why humanity still cannot turn its back on it. If you want to keep walking with us through stories of history, spirituality, and secrets covered by time, subscribe to Prophetic History. Explain to support us and give us the motivation to produce even deeper videos in the time ahead. When people speak about the Kaaba, they often begin with the image of a stone structure standing in the desert. But if we stop there, we miss its deepest layer. Because the Kaaba did not come into being as a monument for human admiration, but as a memory planted into human history, a marker set down so that after wandering, people would know where to return. That story begins very early, earlier than every civilization, earlier than every dynasty, earlier even than the idea of history as we understand it. It begins at the moment human beings first tasted the distance between themselves and the Creator. When Adam left paradise, he did not only lose a place, he lost a state, the state of nearness, of connection, of living in an unbroken presence of the sacred. From that moment on, humanity stepped into a new life, the life of searching. The Kaaba appears within that context, not as an architectural idea but as a spiritual anchor. On the wide earth, vast, untamed, and not yet named, human beings needed a place to know they were not completely abandoned. The first laying of the Kaaba's foundation was not construction in the ordinary sense, but a gesture of repentance shaped into space, a place to return, a place to stand in the right position within the order of existence. What matters is this: the Kaaba was not born from strength, but from longing. A longing for a lost closeness, for an order that was once whole. That is why, from the beginning, it did not take the form of a grand temple. It took the form of a quiet confession. Humanity has strayed, but the path back still exists. Then the great flood came and washed away every physical trace. What human hands had built was erased. But some things do not exist in order to be destroyed. The Kaaba vanished from the visible geography, but it did not vanish from the sacred order. That ground remained kept, as if a page had been folded waiting to be opened again. This reveals a deep truth. The sacred does not depend entirely on material form in order to exist. It can be covered, but it cannot be deleted. Generations passed. Humanity spread, multiplied, formed new communities. And then, within that flow, one man was called to awaken the buried memory. When Ibrahim was commanded to return to that barren valley, he was not given the task of creating something new. He was given the task of remembering that a covenant once stood here, remembering that humanity once knew what it meant to return to a single center. Ibrahim and Ismail rebuilding the Kaaba was not ordinary building. It was an act of reaffirmation, reaffirming that human beings do not manufacture ultimate meaning for themselves. Each stone placed did not only raise a wall, it strengthened a truth. The center of life is not power, wealth, or lineage, but submission. Notably, the prayer spoken during that work did not aim at the greatness of the structure, but at the acceptance of the Creator. That shows what the Kaaba has always been. Its value is not in its shape, but in intention. Not in height, but in direction. Not in human presence, but in the human awareness of whom they stand before. The Kaaba, therefore, becomes a symbol of a shared memory carried by every person, whether consciously or not. The memory that there was once an order in which human beings knew they were not the absolute center. The memory that peace does not come from controlling the world, but from standing in the right place within it. In this part of the story, the Kaaba is not yet the center of crowds, not yet the destination of millions of footsteps. It is an ancient whisper, a sign planted in history to say, no matter how far people travel, no matter how lost they become, the point of return still remains. And that prepares the next part, when the memory is distorted, replaced, and finally must be purified to return to its true nature. There is a quiet law that runs through human history. People rarely destroy the sacred by open violence at the beginning. They do it by very small steps, reasonable steps, steps that look right, and that is why corruption is more dangerous than public attack. After the primal covenant was reaffirmed, the Kaaba did not disappear. It still stood there, But slowly its meaning began to shift, not by denying Allah, but by diluting his central place. People did not say they did not need God. They only said they needed additional intermediaries, symbols that felt closer, easier to control, more compatible with tribal interests and the social order they were building. That is the most dangerous moment in the history of faith, when the sacred still has a name but has lost its direction. The Kaaba, born as an empty space, was gradually filled. Idols appeared not because people hated emptiness, but because they feared it. Emptiness forces a person to face the invisible directly, to face personal responsibility, to face unconditional submission. Idols, by contrast, allow negotiation with the divine, with conscience, with oneself. And when the Kaaba became a display of symbols, it kept its form, but lost its soul. What is sobering is this. During that period, the Kaaba did not collapse. It remained the center of Mecca, still honored, still visited. Yet that outward continuity hid a more frightening truth. People can preserve the form of the sacred while losing its substance. The Kaaba became a center of power, tribal prestige, economy, and influence. And in that process, it was used rather than served. When an army came intending to destroy the Kaaba, what occurred was not human victory, but a warning. The house was protected, but not because the people guarding it deserved it. It was protected because its meaning was not yet permitted to vanish from history. But that protection stopped at the structure. It did not mean corruption had ended. The world needed more than a miracle. It needed a redefinition. The appearance of Muhammad was not an accidental event that simply followed history. It was the answer to a long season of misalignment. He did not come to demolish the Kaaba. He came to restore it to what it was. And this matters. Purification does not begin with hammers or fire, but with truth spoken in silence. When the idols fell, what truly collapsed was not wood and stone, but an entire false system of meaning that had stood for too long. The Kaaba was not taken back by power. It was freed from layers that did not belong to it. The empty space was restored, and with it an ancient truth was placed back at the center, that nothing is to be worshipped but Allah, and nothing has the right to stand between the human being and Him. That moment did not only change Mecca, it changed how human beings understood worship itself. The Kaaba was no longer a tribal possession, no longer a political tool, no longer a cultural symbol to be manipulated. It returned to its essence, a point of reference for all humanity, where every division becomes meaningless when people stand before the Creator. But something deeper is happening. The purification of the Kaaba is not only a historical event, it is a pattern repeated inside each person's spiritual life, because each heart can also become a Kaaba that has been filled. At first it is made for one center, but over time small idols crowd in. Ego, fear, ambition, the craving for approval, power, money. The heart still beats, still functions, still carries the name faith, but it has slipped off its axis. Purification, therefore, is not only breaking what is false, it is restoring the emptiness necessary for what is true to be present. The Kaaba was purified to become again the center of Tawhid, and whoever turns toward it is invited to do the same work within. This part of the story reveals a difficult truth. The sacred does not vanish when people turn away. It only waits to be called back. And from the moment the Kaaba is restored to its true nature, a new motion begins. No longer turning around power or inherited custom, but turning around submission expressed through the human body. That is when ritual stops being mere form and becomes the living memory of the soul, leading into the next stage of the journey. One thing often confuses those who watch from a distance. Why, once they see the Kaaba, Are people not satisfied with simply standing and looking? Why must they circle it, keep walking, try to touch those silent stone walls? The answer is not in the outward form of the rite, but in what is awakened inside the human being while that rite is happening. Tawaf was not created to generate motion, but to break the ego's illusion of stillness. When a person enters that circle, he gives up his own position at the center. No more front and back, no more above and below, no more direction that privileges the self. Only a repeated movement in which each step becomes a wordless declaration. My life does not revolve around me. I am revolving around something greater than me. 7 circuits are not merely a technical requirement, they are a rhythm. That rhythm forces a person to remain long enough for inner resistance to begin dissolving. The first circle is often full of awareness, full of thoughts, full of effort to do it correctly. But the longer one goes, the more tired one becomes. And in that fatigue, the ego's thin armor begins to crack. When the body no longer has the strength to control, the heart begins to speak. Strangely, Tawaf does not push a person outward. It pulls him inward. Even in the middle of a crowd, he faces the most private parts of himself. Prayers stop being polished. They become broken, interrupted, sometimes only sobs without sentences. Because this rite is not designed to display piety, it is designed to expose inner truth. Sa'i continues that motion in another way. No longer the calm circle, but urgent walking between 2 fixed points. Hajar's story is not reenacted merely to stir historical emotion, but to remind us that real faith is often born in helplessness. She ran not because she was certain she would find water, but because she had no other choice. Sa'i does not glorify strength. It glorifies absolute entrustment when every human option is exhausted. Zamzam appears not as a reward for effort, but as an answer to release. That water does not flow because Hajar ran enough times. It flows because there is a moment when a human being placed trust beyond control. And that is why Zamzam is not only water, it is the memory that mercy is not limited by circumstance. Hajj from the outside can be misunderstood as a major trip, a massive event, an intense religious experience. But for the one inside it, Hajj is not a journey of arriving. It is a journey of returning. Returning to a call that has echoed from far back before a person had a name, before he had a personal history. When he says Labbaik, he is not only answering Ibrahim. He is answering a deep inner summons he may never have named, yet has always carried. That may be why the first sight of the Kaaba rarely feels like a simple visual experience. People do not only see a structure, they see the meeting point of every prayer they have ever whispered. Prayers in private rooms, in darkness, in desperation, in silence. Suddenly all of it has a shape, and when what was abstract becomes visible, emotion cannot help but rise. Touching the Kaaba in that context is no longer a merely symbolic act. It is the reflex of a soul that has returned to the right direction. After a lifetime of praying toward it, the hand finally rests on the place once reached only by invisible faith. That gesture feels like completion, not because the person has achieved something, but because he has admitted something, that he needs an anchor outside himself. Ritual, then, is not a chain of movements to memorize. It is the body's language when words are no longer enough. The body circles, runs, stands, touches, weeps, on behalf of what the heart cannot fully say. In that moment, a person stops debating meaning. He lives inside it. This part of the journey reveals a profound truth. Ritual is not prescribed to satisfy God. It is prescribed to reveal the human being, his fragility, his dependence, his hunger to belong to an order larger than himself. And when that happens, the Kaaba stops being only an outer point. It becomes a center rebuilt inside the pilgrim, preparing him for the final question this journey will force him to face. When pilgrims leave the sacred valley, they do not carry the Kaaba in their luggage. Yet many realize something strange. They carry a question not loud, not urgent, but persistent in ordinary life. Because at its deepest level, the Kaaba is not a place to stay, but a place that forces a person to ask how he will live after returning to the right direction. In the modern world, where anything can become a center, money, power, reputation, ego, fear, the Kaaba exists as a paradox. It does not change with the era, does not chase human desire, does not reshape itself to match trends. That is why it becomes a silent measure. Anyone can turn toward it 5 times a day. But the real question is, does our life truly revolve around what we turn our face toward? The qibla creates something unprecedented in human history. Every day, from crowded cities to remote villages, from tight rooms to vast mosques, billions perform the same act, turning in one direction, without meeting, without sharing language, without the same skin or nationality. A repeated movement that quietly forms a global spiritual network. No center of political power has ever achieved that, only the Kaaba. In a world fractured by ideology, nationalism, class divisions, and historical hatred, the Kaaba stands as a living rebuttal. In Tawaf, no one is preferred. No one walks faster because of status. No one is slowed because of origin. The circle erases what people normally cling to in order to define themselves. And that is why it irritates the ego. But that is also why it frees a person from the burden of proving his worth to others. The Kaaba reminds us that unity does not come from everyone being the same, but from everyone turning around the right center. When that center is replaced, society splinters into fragments, each fragment believing itself ultimate. But when the center is restored, difference stops being a threat and becomes diversity within one order. Prophecies about a time when the Kaaba will no longer be honored are often heard as distant warnings about the future. But more deeply, they are a mirror for the present. Because the Kaaba loses meaning not when its walls are destroyed, but when people no longer let it orient their lives. When Hajj becomes only travel. When Tawaf becomes only motion. When the qibla becomes only geography. Then the collapse has already begun, earlier inside the human heart. What is sobering is this: the Kaaba does not defend itself with power. It does not speak when insulted. It does not resist when forgotten. It simply stands, fixed, waiting for human beings to answer their own question. And that silence makes responsibility impossible to outsource. We cannot blame the era. We cannot blame society. We cannot blame circumstances. Each person must ask, what is the center of my life? When the Kaaba is mentioned among the last signs of history, it is not a threat. It is a logical conclusion. If humanity completely turns away from the sacred, its center will vanish as well. Not because Allah needs the Kaaba, but because human beings need it to keep from dissolving into chaos. When the center is gone, every orbit becomes meaningless. And here the end of the journey is not in Mecca, but in each individual life. The Kaaba has done its work. It points to the center. The rest belongs to the human being. Will we let our daily choices, how we earn, how we love, how we handle power and pain, turn around the same axis we face in prayer? Because in the end, the Kaaba does not demand that we remain there forever. It demands only one thing: do not let your life revolve around a counterfeit center. If that is held firm, then wherever we are still living in the right orbit. And then the Kaaba is no longer just a point on a map. It becomes a principle of life, quiet but unshakable, guiding a person through history, through chaos, and through the limits of himself. The first lesson is to learn how to identify the center. Ask yourself, what is truly controlling your decisions, big and small? Second, learn how to preserve the necessary emptiness inside. Do not let too many idols crowd in and take the place of the sacred. Third, turn ritual into life. Let submission appear not only in prayer, but in how you face money, power, wounds, and other people. And finally, remember that inner unity always comes from turning toward one direction, not from trying to please every direction. If stories like this help you see history, faith, and yourself at a deeper level, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can explore more valuable knowledge about prophetic history, spiritual depth, and lessons that remain alive for today's world. And don't forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained so we have the motivation to keep producing deeper, more honest, and more meaningful content in the videos ahead.